Welcome to the Real Estate Guys radio program. I'm your host, Robert Helms. As real estate investors, we're always looking for the path of progress. Today, we're going to talk about how demand, policy, and zoning impact real estate values. And we've got a great guest on the Real Estate Guys radio program.
Stop for a moment. Why are you listening to this show? Are you dreaming of a bigger, brighter financial future? More personal freedom to live life on your own terms? What if there was just one skill that could make it happen? There is. Sales. Robert Kiyosaki says every entrepreneur must be good at sales. It's true for investors too. Sales is how you attract money, people, and opportunities. Sales is the skill used to negotiate deals and lead your team. Sales skills are essential to success. The good news is, it's a learnable skill. The great news is, we've created a 2-day interactive workshop to teach those skills to you. Make plans today to attend How to Win Funds and Influence People, Mastering the Art of Financial Selling. For dates and details, send an email to sales@realestateguysradio.com or visit realestateguysradio.com and look under events. Gain the skills you need to succeed. Email sales@realestateguysradio.com or look under the events tab at realestateguysradio.com.
Memphis is famous for being the home of the king of rock and roll, but it's also the king of cash flow. If you're looking for affordable cash flow properties, it's hard to beat Memphis. Get your portfolio rocking and more cash flowing your way by calling Terry Kerr at Mid-South Home Buyers. Terry's the king of turnkey properties. Contact Terry through the resource section at realestateguysradio.com. And be sure to order Terry's tips for turnkey rental property investing report. It's free. Just send your request to turnkey@realestateguysradio.com. Welcome to the Real Estate Guys radio show. I'm your host, Robert Helms. With me, as usual, it's financial strategist and co-host Russell Gray.
Hey, Robert.
We love real estate. We love talking about real estate. We love thinking about real estate. And sometimes we have to approach real estate from a little different perspective. I think that is part of today's show. We take it for granted that real estate prices and values are driven by supply and demand. And of course, if you listen to our show for any period of time, you know that we break out of the demand what we call capacity to pay. Just because you want a bigger or nicer house or want to move to a different city, if you can't afford to do that, either because you don't have the money or you don't have the employment or there aren't the right loans available, then that's not true demand. Now, of course, in classical demand, that's part of the equation, but we break it out because we think it's important. And today what we're going to talk about is what really affects values. Why is some property worth more than other property?
Yeah, so, the capacity to pay issue, exactly what you said, mortgage rates, incomes, employment, that's going to have an impact. But on the supply side, the question is how much inventory is really available? And so you have to look at things that allow supply to expand, and you have to look at things that constrict supply. Some of those are obvious. If you show up in San Francisco or Manhattan, you look around and you're like, there is no developable land. Every single building is on top of every other building. There's zero lot lines. There's little tiny streets. There's just no place at all for demand to expand physically.
In Manhattan, they sell air rights.
Yeah, exactly. Then you go to other areas and you find out, you look around and you're like, wow, there is tons of land. Like Australia, for example. You go to Australia and you're like, I don't get it. There's 20 million people on this continent that's bigger than the United States of America. And yet you have a constriction of supply. Well, it's not land. They've got gobs of land. There's something else constricting the supply. And sometimes those things are economic reasons. Sometimes those things are political reasons. Sometimes it's topography or weather. There's a lot of different factors. But if you understand how to look at a particular market and begin to gauge some of the things that are going on, some of which are visible and some of which you have to kind of look under the scene a little bit and pay attention, ear to the ground, you can begin to anticipate changes in supply and demand in such a way that you can either escape a problem before it forms, or you can jump in and put yourself into the path of progress.
Well, sure. And the thing about most of this is it moves fairly slowly and most people aren't looking. So a marketplace. Think of a marketplace you know pretty well. Maybe it's a place you grew up. Maybe it's a place you live now. You know which areas of town maybe to stay away from, and you know where the desirable area is. I know we've been in several cities where we've been driving along with a provider, someone in our world that helps people find investments, and he'll say, well, this side of this street, stay away from. Anything north of here is good. Well, if we were just driving ourselves, we'd have no idea of the nuance of that. And that's happened for us in several places. The challenge is, as real estate investors, especially if we're looking to invest outside of our home market or outside of the market that most of our investments are in, we don't have that level of understanding, which is why we always are going to support having a great team around you because they'll know that. But those things just kind of happen organically in a market where the agents and the developers and the investors kind of know, oh, here's where the better deals are. We have a great example of that on the Atlanta field trip. There are two distinct areas that were developed by the same developer at the same time many, many years ago. The exact floor plans of houses, the exact lot sizes, everything is the same. Fast forward over 30 years, one of them is a blighted rundown area, and the other is a thriving gentrification area. Now, lots of things contributed to that over the years, but the reality is you can see it clearly today. Over time, not as clearly.
Well, I'll give you an example. So growing up, I grew up in Santa Clara Valley, and there was right on the border in West San Jose and Cupertino. Well, Cupertino is famous today as a home of Apple Computer and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that Cupertino had going for it was it had some of the best schools, best ranked school districts. Well, that didn't show up on a zip code map necessarily, but some of the divisions of what school you got to go to was predicated on these zip code maps.
Sure.
And so there was a period of time where right on the border, a chunk of San Jose either got annexed by Cupertino or vice versa. And I don't remember because I was a kid, but I remember hearing the adults talk about what happened. So what happened is the price, and again, I don't remember exactly which way it went, but the price either rose or fell fairly dramatically, fairly quickly, as soon as the change in zip code occurred. And, of course, my folks weren't real estate people, so they didn't understand what happened and why. It wasn't until many, many years later when I got into the business, I look back and go, oh, I get it. I know what happened. But they, as non-sophisticated real estate people, got completely blindsided by it. So homeowners literally had a dramatic shift in their home value and their home equity simply because somebody changed arbitrarily a school district line, and that created a change in home values.
That happened in the area I live in a different way. Same exact scenario, school district map changed. Here was the difference. The property tax was affected because one school district had a different property tax basis. In the area I live in, a lot of the property tax goes towards the schools, which is why our schools are unbelievably fabulous. But all of a sudden, it changed the property tax in an area. Give you another example from Silicon Valley, right? You know that I sold real estate in that area for lots and lots of years. It used to be that way out in the southern part of the valley was a long, long, long commute. And prices were less expensive. People would drive a little and save a lot. All of a sudden, they put in the Highway 85 freeway.
Well, it wasn't all of a sudden. I mean,
that's true.
They had that thing carved out for as long as I could remember.
They did.
One day they finally built it.
My dad worked on the original survey crew of that when he was in his 30s. So that's a while ago. And it took 30 years to get that built. But the minute it opened, what happened to housing values? They rose $80,000 to $100,000 in a year because all of a sudden people that lived out in Blossom Valley could commute to Palo Alto and places north.
Well, this is the argument about infrastructure. When you put in infrastructure, I go back to what I said in Australia, part of the problem in the outback, besides the environmental impact and some of the things they're trying to do there, is there's just not the infrastructure. A government can't afford to put in infrastructure. You have sparse population. So the population all gets herded into an area where they can afford to make those investments in infrastructure. Same thing like we're talking about what's going on in Belize, right? You look at Belize, and Belize has been able to have growth because you're getting new pipelines of people coming in through airlines picking up routes, right? They're responding to demand, people wanting to go to Belize. And so they're picking up flights, which is bringing people to Belize. And on the other side of that equation, where are people going to stay?
Right.
It's a tourist town, right? So, of course, that's a market we pay a lot of attention to. But
when
the concept is the same.
When we first started going to Belize, there were 6 flights a day on Saturday. Today, there's more than 20 flights a day on Saturday, all large body aircraft. That's a huge change in demand in a relatively short period of time. So the point is, and we have 1,000 stories like this, and you probably have some of your own, the point is there are boundaries, some artificial, some legitimate, that create value. What drives value? We often joke that, if you want inexpensive property, go out to rural Arkansas, because land in rural Arkansas is cheap. And 100 years ago, it was cheap. And 50 years ago, it was cheap. And 100 years from now, it's probably going to be cheap, right? So people don't want cheap land. They want good value. They want to be in the path of progress. And if we study what's happening in markets, we can figure out the path of progress. I remember when we bought a property and it was in escrow, and during the time it was in escrow, they announced a new off-ramp of the freeway on that street. Instantly, the value of that property went up 20, 30% while we were in escrow. And people were like, wow, what a windfall. It's, luck. We're like, you know what? We knew it was happening.
It's like the hospital deal where we bought that lot right across the street from a proposed hospital. As soon as the hospital got announced, that parcel went way up in value because all of a sudden it was right next to this huge amenity. Now, nothing changed physically. People driving by every day couldn't see what just happened. But of course, because we were paying attention to what was the planning commission was doing, we knew about it. We saw it. We were able to acquire the parcel and we got a quick pop just because of the announcement.
Absolutely. And that can happen if you're paying attention. And so when you just look at buying a property and putting a tenant in it, sometimes you don't think about these things. Sometimes that line we talk about isn't a school district line, but it's a public housing agency line. In many big metros, there are more than one PHA, a public housing agency that administers the Section 8 program and other programs. So if I am a Section 8 landlord, one side of the street could be different than the other side in terms of how likely I am to get a tenant, how much they'll pay, what the demand is, all those things. And so there are nuances you have to understand, and it's not obvious at first blush.
This isn't exactly germane to the conversation, but you mentioned Section 8. It made me think of something that's going on right now, and that is there's some talk about cutting back on HUD's budget. And part of the results of that HUD budget cutback is they're estimating approximately 250,000 Section 8 vouchers are going to get canceled. So we've been talking about this for a very, very long time on the show, that the idea that if we do come into some type of an austerity program in government, either because somehow they lock up on the debt ceiling and there's forced cuts, or you bring in a conservative administration and Congress that is going to cut some of these government programs, you don't have to agree with it or disagree with it politically. I mean, it is what it is. They're going to do what they're going to do. And if that funding goes down, then that's a pipeline of money supply into a specific niche of investment real estate that you could be on either the winning or the losing end on, depending on if you're paying attention.
Absolutely. And that's what this show is about, paying attention. We're going to talk about a lot more of this. Got an article that's going to drive some of this home, and we've got a great guest before we're done. You're tuned to the Real Estate Guys radio program. I'm your host, Robert Helms.
Live nationwide, you're listening to the Real Estate Guys. Find out more at realestateguysradio.com.
Are you ready to profit in paradise? Hi, it's Robert Helms, and if you think real estate investing means tenants, toilets, and termites, think again. Located just a short plane ride from the U.S., a virtually untouched paradise awaits, the beautiful country of Belize. When you go to Belize with the Real Estate Guys, you'll spend 4 fabulous days discovering one of the most intriguing real estate markets I've ever seen. With its jungle rainforests, pristine beaches, and 81-degree turquoise water, Belize is one of the most beautiful places on earth. Plus, it's considered one of the top 7 tax havens in the world. Belize property is on the rise, and many experts think the best is yet to come. But don't just take my word for it. Come experience Belize firsthand at our upcoming investor field trip. When you join us, you'll discover the many reasons we love Belize, like tremendously undervalued beachfront land, super low taxes, ease of doing business, and so much more. Get the details at realestateguysradio.com. Just click on events. See paradise for yourself. Click events at realestateguysradio.com, and I'll see you in beautiful Belize. The Real Estate Guys are throwing a party, and you're invited. Join Russ and I at the New Orleans Investment Conference, October 25th through 28th. Now in its 43rd year, it's the nation's longest-running investment conference and features some of the biggest names in economics and investing, including Robert Kiyosaki, Chris Martenson, Peter Schiff, and many, many more. The Real Estate Guys are speaking in 3 different sessions and attending lots of others, and we're hosting a hospitality suite one of the evenings for our friends and listeners, including some VIPs for you to mingle with. So make plans today to join the Real Estate Guys at the New Orleans Investment Conference. With everything going on in the world, no serious investor can afford to miss it. Send an email to neworleansparty@realestateguysradio.com, and we'll get you all the details. That's neworleansparty@realestateguysradio.com, and we'll see you in New Orleans.
Hi, this is Kevin Harrington, an original shark from the hit TV show Shark Tank, and you're listening to The Real Estate Guys.
Welcome back to the Real Estate Guys radio program. Thanks for tuning into the show, no matter how you do that. We're on the radio every week and on the podcast anytime you want. We're talking today about the path of progress and how demand, policy, and zoning impact real estate values. We've talked about the way that school lines and zip codes and those kinds of things can affect real estate. Then there's just the stuff that people know in the marketplace. Hey, this side of the tracks, that side of the tracks, this side of the river. Let's talk about specifically something that is artificial and prevalent almost everywhere, not everywhere, and that's zoning. Zoning has to do with policy, and zoning affects value.
Yeah, I think, the most obvious thing that investors look for, you might be able to find a residential house that could be rezoned or is zoned for either R1 or commercial or retail. And you can begin to do other things with it that are more valuable depending on what's going on in the market. The idea that you get a little single family home in what used to be a little residential neighborhood on Main Street now is turned into a little cute downtown, and you open up a little law office or medical practice or accounting practice, and you turn that house, what used to be a very nice home, into, either one large office for one firm or a collection. We first met Garrett Sutton, and I went out and visited with him at his offices in Reno. He runs a law practice. He's Rich Dad's legal advisor. He had his business based in one of these old
Right,
homes.
like almost Victorian style.
Yeah, it was almost a Victorian style home. And the bedrooms had been converted into offices and a little kitchen area. And so that's a very popular thing to do. But it obviously generates a lot more cash flow by having little businesses in each office than it would by having just a single family residing in the entire home.
I can think of literally a dozen cities where this exact area exists, where it was built as homes, but today it is kind of the main drag. And the issue is, again, about zoning. It has to be zoned commercial. Let me read you an article. This came out of the San Jose Mercury News, July 27th of this year. Palo Alto tells church tenants they need to move. First Baptist Church in Palo Alto is not allowed to lease space to tenants such as music and dance schools and therapists because of its location in an R1 residential zoning designation, according to the city of Palo Alto. A dozen commercial tenants, from music and dance schools to adolescent therapists, soon will have to move from their home base at First Baptist Church in Palo Alto or run afoul of the city's zoning laws. So this is a case where the church has been for many years renting out this space. And of course, the problem is the church needs the money to survive because it's a high rent district. Palo Alto, if you don't know, very, very high rent district. My very first listing ever was on Emerson Street in Palo Alto, and unbelievable values there back then and today. And so this church relies on the income it gets from these tenants, except the zoning was never changed.
Yeah. And so this is a situation where a landlord, the church, is happily collecting its rent from its tenants, these businesses. These businesses have established themselves in the neighborhood and built their clientele and all of those different things that you do as a retail operation. And it's all working great until some bureaucrat decides that it needs to change. Now, maybe there's a very good reason for it. I'm not on the Palo Alto City Planning Commission. I have no idea why they're doing what they're doing. But, you've got a situation now where somebody's getting blindsided. Quite a few somebodies are getting blindsided. And I'm guessing at some point in time, there was some chatter going on about this. So I don't know if they were in there, arguing about it or whatever, how all that goes. But the point is, this is an example of what happens when either a zoning code changes or zoning that has existed and for whatever reason has been exempted. People look the other way. People didn't know. Whatever it was, then all of a sudden it appears and rears its ugly head and everything changes and the business proposition for that church is changing.
And of course, the article goes on to both sides of the story, right? There's a gal there who has an office and has for years. And for what she's paying right now will cover 1.5 days of rent in a current commercial location.
She's out of business.
She's out of business. She can't raise her rates enough to do that. And then the church says, we feel like everything we do benefits the city and its residents. It's all ministry to us, but the city doesn't see it that way. So they're saying, hey, we're doing things like having classes for kids, and we do yoga for single moms, and we do all these things that we do. And yeah, these are businesses, and they're not making a lot of money. They aren't big businesses. They're small businesses. Meanwhile, on the other side, they say that the intensity of activity of the church is not compatible with the neighborhood zoning, according to the letter from the city. There's too much going on. People that want quiet enjoyment of the residences on the street are saying, there are people coming and going at all hours. So you see both sides of it.
Yeah.
We're using this as a first of all, it's current, but also it's just an indication of what can happen when you don't pay attention to zoning laws. But let's step back, because why does zoning exist in the first place? It's not everywhere. There's a lot of countries that we're in where there is no zoning. The city of Houston, Texas is notorious for having zero zoning. You can have a pawn shop right next to a high-end car dealership, right next to you name it.
Well, the zoning is determined by the market. If you decide, hey, I want to locate next to this type of business. I want to associate with this type of neighborhood or whatever. You get to do what you want to do, and somebody else isn't deciding it for you. The marketplace just figures it out.
Sometimes the zoning is just relaxed. We built a project in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we had an infill piece, so it was almost the last piece, except for right next door, there was a small, just under an acre parcel. And all the questions came in from our prospective buyers and tenants saying, what's going to go there? What's going to go there? And it's like, well, according to Las Vegas zoning law, it could be a strip club, it could be a bar, or it could be a retail business. Turns out today, it's a Rolls-Royce dealership.
So they strip you of your money.
Exactly. So you just don't know, right? But what does zoning do? Zoning allows a city or a government or a planning entity to kind of help shape the future growth of an area. And so zoning isn't necessarily a bad thing because it says, well, this is the area we're going to have, commercial, and this is the area we're going to have maybe light industrial. And over here, well, that's going to be all residential. These are going to be apartments, right? So there's different zoning, and this isn't a show on zoning. We can get into the weeds, but let's not. Instead, it's just to say what is the highest and best use or the preferred use for different areas. And that actually can drive value up.
Well, I think the bigger point is it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree. It doesn't matter if you think it's a good idea. Some people think master planning is fabulous. Other people, not so much, right? If you've ever lived in a housing area where you have an HOA and they tell you what color palette you can paint your house with or what kind of landscape you can have, some people think that's great because it creates a nice uniform quality and consistency in the neighborhood. Other people don't like it at all because it infringes upon their right to have it the way they want.
We call those protective covenants or restrictive covenants. And the example we like to use, if you're the guy who likes to have your 1968 Chevy up on jacks in your driveway and so you work out on the weekends and your HOA says you can't do that, you view that as a restrictive covenant. Your neighbor views it as a protective covenant.
Right.
Protects them from the unsightly, side of this car that's up on jacks all the time. For you, it's like, hey, I want to do work on my car on the weekends, right? So it's not right or wrong. It's just understanding it.
Yeah. And so, but the thing is, in those situations, when you buy a property, they hand you a big stack of documents and typically the agent will review it with you and encourage you. In fact, you sign saying that you've read it, even though nobody does, but you should. And that way you understand exactly what you're getting into. But sometimes these things change, like with this church. And, and again, I don't know what the actual zoning was or why it wasn't being enforced.
It claims it's always been R1. And so you know what happens at a church? Like all of a sudden, there's the gal that wants to teach yoga on the weekends. You say, well, we have this little closet over here. You could store your stuff. And before you know, it's a business and she's charging for classes and it's all good, right? And then she pays some rent to the church. I'm sure it grew up organically over time, which has only happened 10,000 other places on earth.
Yeah. But they weren't flying under the radar. They were
flying under the radar until probably somebody complained. But again, this is the argument for zoning. Hey, that activity isn't supposed to be here. It's supposed to be over here. The counter argument is about the free market folks who say, well, like Houston, hey, let the market decide. We're not here to say which is right or wrong, and we don't even care which is right or wrong to you. What we want you to understand is that it affects value, and it can affect value both positively and negatively.
Yeah, well, it starts with desirability or lack of desirability. That's certainly a possibility. It starts with availability and lack of availability. If all of a sudden a certain type of inventory goes away, like these affordable retail areas in this church, because the zoning is being enforced now, they can't. That inventory's gone away. Okay, so when you're looking at a particular area, you want to begin to understand how these things work. And I think one of the things that's interesting, in fact, our guest is going to share some stuff with you because I actually saw him do a presentation on this topic. And I've been following real estate for a very, very long time. I read everything. I've heard a lot of people comment. And, I've never heard a guy make this argument before. I've never heard this argument made. And so I listened to it. I thought, gosh, we should get this guy on the radio because it's really interesting. So I think you're really going to enjoy what he has to say. But the point is that what a piece of land can be used for, it can be dictated by zoning or some other form of policy. So when that happens, it can take the property out of circulation, or at least out of circulation for particular uses, and it can affect the flow of money and people in to or out of an area. We had another situation when Arizona decided to crack down on illegals.
Right.
And, some of that's going on again right now.
Illegal immigrants, people who are staying in the United States who didn't have the correct status.
Yes. And of course, Arizona being a border state had quite a few of those people. And those people need places to live. And so landlords had those types of places. Well, when you go buy a big apartment complex like we did, you don't know what the tenant mix is, I mean, it's not like you have certificates of citizenship as part of your rental agreement. So, we're going through anyway. So the long story short is all of a sudden the law enforcement changed. The law always existed, but the enforcement of the law, just like with this church situation, all of a sudden ratcheted up. All of those tenants scattered. They moved out because they were afraid of getting deported. And now we had empty buildings.
Yep.
And our entire tenant mix, our entire demographic, our entire culture of our community changed. And it literally happened overnight.
Based on a policy decision.
Based on a policy decision, which we weren't paying any attention to because we were out of town investors. It never even occurred to us, which is why we have these conversations on the show. So wherever you are, wherever you're investing, you're thinking about things you wouldn't normally think about until they're a problem. You want to think about them before they're a problem.
When you're learning what you need to learn to be a real estate agent, a lot of the classes that you take are about fair housing and opportunity. And they always talk about back in the 50s when there was steering and redlining. And those were not actual boundaries. They were, hey, this part of town is where people that are green go. And people that are blue with yellow spots, they stay over here. And real estate agents were encouraged in the training not to discriminate against people based on any of those things, whether they're blue with spots or green. They all have equal opportunity to housing. Of course, fair housing law is about that. But prior to that, it was just kind of the known thing. Oh, you're that person? Well, you go over here. Well, that created the same issue in terms of value. Certain areas were not as valuable. And again, that's not a judgment. That's just the reality of what the tenants would pay in those areas. Right now, there are tenant neighborhoods. They aren't really tenant neighborhoods, but they're probably zoned R1 residential. But the majority of people that live in the houses in those neighborhoods are tenants. They don't own the house. And you can probably think of an area like that around you. Then there's other areas where almost exclusively it's homeowners. People that live there own the homes, maybe one or two executive renters. That also maintains a value proposition. So all of this stuff affects you. And it's not to get into the weeds and get all worried about it. It's to be aware. The things that are maybe not obvious can be found out with enough due diligence.
Yeah, I think the big point there, and we talk about this all the time, because it is really difficult if you're going to be serious as an investor. You're going to be talking about economics. You're going to be talking about politics. And politics and economics often go hand in hand because a lot of policies are economically driven.
Yep.
And so we often get caught up in the way we want the world to be. It's like we disagree with this, or we agree with this, or the world should do this, or the world shouldn't do that, or that's not fair, or this would be better. Doesn't really matter. I mean, it does, but it doesn't. It doesn't when you're sitting there trying to figure out what is the reality, because we invest in a real world, and the real world isn't perfect. It isn't pretty. It isn't fair. It just is what it is. And Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, talks about confronting the brutal facts. That's how you make good decisions. So sometimes, quite often, we have to set aside our political preferences and the things that we want out of life and say,
like rent control. Right?
Exactly.
Rent control is a great example of that. There are certain jurisdictions that have very severe rent control so they can keep affordability, which is a great, noble thing. You know, the godfather of real estate, my dad, has always talked about, well, that's all good. I just don't think that it should be me that has to take care of that as the landlord, as the property owner. If income property is valued based on the income you can derive from it, and there's an artificial limit to how much income through rent control you can get, then there's an artificial constriction on price. So guess what we get to do as investors? We get to decide whether or not we want to invest in areas that have rent control. We can argue about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we make our investment decision based on the economic reality.
Yeah. And so just using the rent control example, if you go look at areas that have rent control, you say, did it create affordable housing? It created low cost housing, but it didn't create quality housing, because what happens is the incentive for a landlord to invest in his property, make it nicer, so he can raise the rents and improve the value, that incentive goes away. And so instead, he doesn't invest in the property. It falls into disrepair, and then it continues to ratchet down, and you end up with a slum area. Now, somebody says, well, yeah, but it shouldn't be that way because the landlord is greedy. The landlord is doing just like the tenant is doing, just like everybody in the world does. They operate in their self-interest based on the environment they're in. If you want to get somebody to do something that is going to be whatever it is, you have to make it in their self-interest to do it. It's never going to be in a landlord's self-interest to lower rent unless you increase supply and create competition so that in order to attract money to himself, the landlord has to lower prices. And, again, this is where I'm passing judgment. I'm saying, okay, this is how I think it should be. But it doesn't matter because, if I go into Oakland or I go into San Francisco or some of the other areas around the country that have rent control, they're not asking me what I think.
Right.
I mean, they ask me maybe once a year, maybe, and I get to vote for whoever really made the decision, but really I don't get a say so.
No, you vote with your dollars. You decide where
Exactly.
I'm going to invest based on this stuff. So our guest today has an opinion. He's got an opinion about what he thinks, in fact, created the Great Recession. He's a very scholar guy. We'll introduce him when we come back, and we'll play real estate trivia next. You tune to the Real Estate Guys radio program. I'm your host, Robert Helms.
Need help with your real estate investment portfolio? Check out the resources page at realestateguysradio.com.
For investors, timberland has become the symbol of safety. Global tropical timber demand continues to surge as the world's population increases. The need for managed, sustainable timber production forests has never been greater. When stock markets crash, trees keep growing. Direct ownership of fully managed tropical timberland acreage is now available to accredited investors. Prime valuable hardwood groves close to the beautiful Costa Rican border generate and maintain superior long-term wealth. Qualified, accredited investors should email timber@realestateguysradio.com for more information. Consider visiting our forest plantations to see for yourself. Email timber@realestateguysradio.com. This announcement does not constitute either an offer to sell securities or a solicitation of an offer to purchase. Offering made by prospectus only. For more information, email timber@realestateguysradio.com.
Hey, this is Phil Cullen of Def Leppard and Delta Deep, and I'm with the Real Estate Guys.
And welcome back to the Real Estate Guys radio program, heard every weekend on this fantastic radio station all the time at realestateguysradio.com. We're talking today about the path of progress and what influences pricing and value in real estate. Lots of things do. We've got a great guest in just a minute, but first, it's your chance to win a prize for real estate trivia. In just a minute, I'm going to give you a trivia question that has something to do with real estate, and you're going to come up with the answer. When you think you have it, send us an email to trivia@realestateguysradio.com. Include your name, the answer to the question, and your mailing address, because if you're the winner, we're going to send you a copy of Passionistas, Tips, Tales, and Tweetables from Women Pursuing Their Dreams, a great little book with stories from a bunch of passionate women. You're going to love this book, and it could be yours if you know today's real estate trivia question. Last week it was Ask the Guys, and our question was this: name the planet from the movie Avatar. Yeah, it's a big old chunk of real estate, right? The movie Avatar, even though it was a fictional piece of real estate.
It's a digital planet.
Digital planet. Its name was Pandora. Here's our real estate trivia question for this week. The USA's largest collection of funeral service artifacts is housed, of course, at the National Museum of Funeral History. Where's it located? Where would they put the National Museum of Funeral History in the U.S.? Well, if you think you know, or maybe you do know, maybe you've been there, quickly get us an email to trivia@realestateguysradio.com. Trivia@realestateguysradio.com. Include your name, the question's answer, and your mailing address so we can send you a copy of Passionistas, Tips, Tales, and Tweetables from Women Pursuing Their Dreams. That's today's real estate trivia question. We're talking about the things that influence value, and speaking of books, our guest today wrote a book called American Nightmare: How Government Undermines the Dream of Home Ownership. His name is Randall O'Toole. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, written several books, and as Russ mentioned, you had a chance to hear him speak. Fascinating stuff. As we said before, he definitely has an opinion, but open your ears and your mind, and let's see what he has to say about this very topic today on the Real Estate Guys radio program.
Hi, I'm Mark Victor Hans. You're listening to The Real Estate Guys. If you want to expand your consciousness, expand your wealth, expand your future, and have more delight and excite in your future than in your past, keep listening to The Real Estate Guy.
Welcome back to the Real Estate Guys radio program. I'm your host, Robert Helms. The very basis of owning real estate has to do with property rights, and that's different everywhere we go. And there's a different angle we're going to talk about today. Please welcome economist Randall O'Toole with us, who's a senior fellow at Cato Institute. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks for being on the program today. You gave a talk today that was really eye-opening in a lot of ways, and I think real estate investors need to hear what you had to say.
Well, the interesting thing is that governments across the world have interfered in real estate markets to greater or lesser degrees. And it started in 1947 when Great Britain passed what was called the Town and Country Planning Act that heavily restricted what people could do with their land. And instead of saying, oh, this invades property rights, other countries said, let's do the same thing. So far, the United States hasn't done that, but individual states have.
Right.
Particularly, Hawaii was first, California was second, Oregon and Washington, Florida, and then pretty much the whole strip of states from Northern Virginia up to Maine. And what they've done is they've made it owning land. You can own land, but what you can do with your land is so restrictive that you have to get permission from the state, and in fact, often the state will dictate to you what you can do with your land, and that's the only thing you can do. So for example, in my home state of Oregon, if you own land in a rural area, you can't build a single house on your own land unless you own 80 acres, you actually farm it, and you actually earn $80,000 a year farming it.
Okay.
But if you live in an urban area, in a neighborhood of single-family homes, they could come in and upzone you to multifamily housing, and then they have minimum density zoning. If your house burns down, you're not allowed to rebuild it, you have to replace it with an apartment.
Well, this is such a critical thing that I think people don't understand, and it's different everywhere, right? And different in the U.S. maybe than other places too. But, you know, we always talk about how a constriction in the marketplace, whether it be geography or a school district or any kind of constriction, can create an uptick in pricing. But the other side of it is, and you've talked about this, that it can drive these bubble markets. And one of the things that you talked about today was the difference in markets that have these constrictions and what happens. Can you talk about that?
That's right. In the United States, we don't have any markets where we're short of land. What we have are markets where we're short of land that we're allowed to develop.
Yeah.
Nevada, for example, 90% of the land is government owned, so you can't develop it.
Right.
So you've got a problem here. But in California, even New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, there's lots of land. And there are lots of private land, but there's so many regulations that the private landowners aren't allowed to develop it. There are places in Hawaii where you have to get 150 permits to build your house. These kinds of restrictions make it very hard. Well, what that means is the supply for housing, if there's no restrictions, is what economists call elastic. If you look at a supply and demand curve, it's almost a horizontal curve. It doesn't matter what the demand is. There's lots of land, there's lots of building materials, there's lots of labor. We can build new houses and meet the demand. But once the government steps in and starts restricting the supply, then the supply curves get steep, and a small change in demand can lead to a large change in price. So a small increase in demand can lead to a huge change in increase in price, and a small decrease in demand can lead to a huge decrease in price. So you get this huge volatility, and then you get bubbles. California has gone through 3 bubbles since they started imposing these rules in the 1970s. Oregon has gone through 2 bubbles. Hawaii has gone through 3 bubbles. California is now entering another bubble. Housing in San Francisco today costs more, even adjusting for inflation, than it did at the peak of the last bubble. So it's going to come crashing down again, and a lot of people are going to get hurt. Whereas you look at places that don't do this land use regulation, like Texas and North Carolina and Georgia, and you don't see any major fluctuations in housing prices.
Now, Randall, our show's heard in 190 plus countries, but we originate on the radio in San Francisco in Northern California. One of the examples you gave there, I was born in San Jose. Russ grew up in Silicon Valley as I did, and there's been constriction there. Can you talk about the Bay Area?
Well, people think the Bay Area has run out of land, but the reality is only 17% of the land in the 8-county Bay Area has been urbanized.
Yeah.
About 20% has been set aside as regional parks. That means about 63% of the land is private land, but the landowners aren't allowed to develop it. California-wide, California is the most heavily populated state in the union. 95% of the people in California are confined to 5.5% of the land in the state.
Yeah.
It's not because they're out of land. And it's not because they're saving farmland or anything like that. They're saving rolling hills. And in fact, you're seeing developments of prime farmland in the Central Valley for people to commute from Modesto and Stockton to San Jose.
Because the prices are so high.
Because the prices are so high in San Jose.
Yeah.
And we're getting an exodus of low-income people. And people look at San Jose and say, oh, it's a wealthy community. Well, that's because all the poor people have been driven out.
Right.
The number, if we look at what's the most racist urban area in America? Well, guess what? It's San Francisco, because blacks are moving out by the thousands, and the population is growing, but the population of blacks is shrinking.
Well, and from your talk, disproportionately, there's more because of this income equality that happens, and it's probably not just San Francisco. The high property markets are going to drive out people who can't afford to be there.
That's exactly right. And a lot of them are moving to places like Texas, in Houston and Dallas, which have very little land use restrictions. Houston doesn't even have zoning.
Yeah.
The population of blacks is growing faster than the population of whites. And a friend of mine, Joel Kotkin from Los Angeles, calls Houston an opportunity city, because you can move there even if your income is low and you have an opportunity to build wealth. Whereas if you move to San Jose or San Francisco, you have no opportunities to build wealth unless you're very, very talented and very unusual.
You know, this is great stuff, things to be aware of. We're always looking at things like tenant landlord law, and a state that has a more friendly to tenant law might be a place we'd avoid as a real estate investor. But this is a whole other angle to be looking at how the policy dictates that. Of course, that's a lot of what you guys do at Cato. Can you speak to what the solution might be, or what some things that we can do?
Well, the solution is hard because a majority of people still own their own homes, and if you say to them in California, okay, you've got $1 million house here that's really a $250,000 house, and if we relax these land use laws, you're going to lose, a bunch of value in your house.
And tax dollars from property tax alongside,
well,
right?
that's not an issue in California because of Prop 13, but it is an issue in other places. The thing is, because of these laws, we've seen this huge transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, from the young to the old, from minorities to the majority, and those are bad things. If we reverse this, we're going to see a huge transfer of wealth that's going to be from the rich to the poor, from the old to the young, from the whites to the blacks, and I would argue some of those things are good things. How are we going to do it? It's going to take some action by the courts because it's not going to happen democratically.
Gosh, the irony is you could argue if there wasn't these restrictions, you wouldn't have had the situation in the first place, right? The houses wouldn't have gone to $1 million.
That's
but
exactly right.
I see your point completely, so it's always the quandary, right?
In fact, there was a study that was done that found that if you hadn't had these restrictions in Silicon Valley and in New York City, just those two places alone, it would have added 10% to our gross national product. That's $1.7 trillion a year. And just imagine if you expand that to Los Angeles and Portland and Seattle and other cities that have done these things, we're talking about trillions of dollars of lost value because of these land use restrictions that are really producing no benefits for anyone except for the homeowners who are getting windfall profits.
Right. All right, well, this has been great stuff. We appreciate it. Tell folks how they can get involved with the work you guys do at Cato Institute.
Well, cato.org is our website, and if you look me up, Randall O'Toole, on cato.org, you'll be able to download one of my recent papers. It's called The New Feudalism, that gets into this subject. I've also written a book called American Nightmare about how government has undermined the dream of home ownership, and that book is available on Cato's website as well.
All right, there you go. That's Randall O'Toole, Senior Fellow at Cato Institute. Thanks so much for being on the program today.
Thank you.
You're tuned to the Real Estate Guys radio program. When we return, I'm your host, Robert Helms.
Real estate investment advice right in your mailbox. Sign up for the free Real Estate Guys newsletter at realestateguysradio.com.
This portion of the Real Estate Guys radio program is brought to you by International Coffee Farms, where you can own a parcel of land in your very own specialty coffee farm in Panama for as little as $15,000. Here's how it works. Deeded half-acre parcels entitled Specialty Coffee Farms in Boquete, Panama are turnkey managed professionally on your behalf by a team of local experts. Sustainable average income is estimated at 12%, and cash flow can begin within 12 to 15 months from the date of your parcel ownership. International Coffee Farms' mission is to own and operate specialty coffee farms that are economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable. As part of this mission, 20% of the gross profits of each farm is committed to a socially sustainable fund to improve the lives of the Panamanian coffee farm workers and their families. International Coffee Farms currently owns and operates 9 specialty coffee farms with half-acre parcels available for immediate ownership. To find out how you can become a coffee farm owner in Boquete, Panama, email coffee@realestateguysradio.com. That's coffee@realestateguysradio.com.
Hi, this is Patrick Donahoe of Paradigm Life. Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of sharing the services of Paradigm Life with you loyal Real Estate Guys Radio listeners through our website, www.beyourbank.com, and also on the annual Investor Summit at Sea. Subsequently, we have seen a variety of financial situations across the socioeconomic spectrum and how everyone, regardless of their situation, would improve their financial lives by following the system we specialize in. As a result of this experience, we have created an online e-learning system so anyone without obligation can learn about the infinite banking concept. This free e-learning program is found on our website, www.beyourbank.com. So check it out today. The website again is www.beyourbank.com.
Hi, this is Lawrence Yun, Chief Economist with National Association of Realtors, and you are listening to The Real Estate Guys.
Welcome back to the Real Estate Guys radio program. Hey, if you ever wanted to do bigger deals with other people's money, coming out to the secrets of successful syndication, your chance to learn how to do that very thing. You can get the details on the website at realestateguysradio.com. Just click the tab that says Events. Pretty fascinating stuff from Randall O'Toole.
It is. You know, the thing that attracted me to go to his session in the first place and hear what he had to say was that I spent a lot of time in the wake of 2008 trying to understand what caused the bubble. Coming out of the mortgage business and being a finance guy, I focused most of my attention on what was going on with the economy and the Fed and availability of loans and, you know, all of those different things, you know, the derivatives markets, mortgage-backed securities, all of the things that have been largely blamed for what happened. Okay, and so this was a completely different take.
Right.
It didn't have to do with the supply of money and the ease of lending. It had to do with the restriction on supply and the ability of the market to meet demand. And so that restriction forced housing prices up, creating bubbles. Now, I can't say that after thinking about this that it's just one thing or the other. I think it's a combination of things.
Yeah.
But this was a perspective that I'd really never considered before. And when you look at the charts and graphs, which of course you can't see on the radio, but they're in the book. And when I saw them, you know, when Randall presented, it was really fascinating how every single market that had bubbled up and bounced back had this one thing in common.
Right.
And the argument that he makes in the book, which I think is excellent, is that if this was a result of a policy that had to do with lending, which was across all markets, the damage would have been uniform across all markets. But it wasn't. And so I thought, that's a great point. So it just goes back to what I'm saying is this idea that you have to keep your mind open. You have to look at people who are looking at things through a lens maybe that you hadn't thought about before. And you have to listen very carefully to what they say and ask yourself, does that make sense? And does the evidence that I can gather and the observations that I can make and the experiences of other people that I can talk to who have firsthand knowledge and credibility in my mind, does it corroborate? And in this case, it does. You know, going forward, when we're looking at markets, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention, maybe a lot more attention to what's going on the zoning side. I mean, I kind of already thought that we did that, but this just was a take that I'd never even considered.
Well, and I'm not negative. Obviously, he has an opinion about it. And yeah, that created a run-up. Lots of us made lots of money in that run-up, by the way. And it created devastation, and lots of us got devastated in it. The thing is, if you can pay attention to it, and there is opportunity. We had a parcel of land that was zoned at a very high commercial level. And we actually went through the process of stepping down the zoning because the buyer who bought the parcel from us, we held it, we thought we were going to build something, the economic downturn came, they wanted to build residential, we had to change the zoning. Much easier for us to do that as the owner than for them to buy it and do it, plus it had tax ramifications and all that kind of stuff. So we went through the whole process of engaging the right attorney to go through a zoning procedure. In some areas, it's very complicated, in some areas it's very easy, but zoning affects value. At the very least, if you're looking in any area where there's a mix of of properties. Mixed use is one of the things that comes to mind. That's a tough thing for city planners and zoning folks to get their mind around. How do you zone something that has residential up top, office in the middle, and retail on the bottom? What's the zoning for that, right?
Yeah.
So it's the changes of use of real estate look, a lot of times we work out of our homes. We both have home offices. Well, you know what? We both live in residential R1 neighborhoods, so we're not really running businesses, or are we? And what about, there's just so many things to think about.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the challenge of when law is unable to keep up with the evolution of society and the way the world is changing. We've seen a lot of that from the technological point of view. Sometimes zoning can actually solve problems. It doesn't necessarily always create problems. For example, you go into some of these areas that have very, very expensive housing because there's limited supply. And I'm just going to give you South Silicon Valley as an example.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of empty office buildings down in the south part of the valley, and there is a shortage of affordable housing. I'm not saying that you would want to take these commercial buildings and turn them into lofts, although some of that has happened in downtown Sacramento and some other areas.
In Dallas, all over, yeah.
Yeah, it happens all over, where somebody comes along and says, look, this town doesn't need any more office space. This town doesn't need more warehouse space.
Like the meat packing district in New York. Right?
Yeah.
They used to pack meat. That's not what they do anymore. Some of those places are real meat markets, but it's a vibrant place now, right? It's changed completely based on progress.
Yeah. So you come along and say, okay, that you weren't able to have residences there, but now we need residences, so we're going to change the zoning. So, if you're an entrepreneurial real estate guy or gal, you can look at something like that and go, hey, what does this market need? Affordable housing. There's another movement right now, tiny houses. I got them on TV. It's all about tiny houses, right? Part of it is just building the acceptance that somebody would really want to live in a 200 square foot house. That's one part of it. But the second part of it is, where do you put these things? You can't go take a place that has a lot that would normally hold 1,600 or 2,000 square foot house, and you could pack maybe 5 of these houses on there.
But the zoning won't allow it.
But the zoning won't allow it. And yet, if you could do that, the big problem in some of these high cost areas is the price of the land. You get a lot more yield on the land without necessarily having to go to vertical. That's another one. Going vertical. So we talked about that when we were active in Las Vegas back in the day, when, the Manhattanization, Oscar Goodman, the Manhattanization of Las Vegas, and there was a big move towards vertical because they saw Las Vegas as becoming really dense and popular like Manhattan in New York. And so the only way to create additional supply was to go up. Well, there are certain places where you have restrictions on going up. You cannot go up unless those restrictions are lifted.
Yeah.
And if those restrictions are lifted, all of a sudden, shazam, you've created a whole bunch of new available inventory.
Look at South Beach in Miami. That's a really interesting example because they have all the old Art Deco, and the zoning states and some of the specific requirements for construction state that you can't change those old facades. In fact, if you're standing in the dead center of the street, say you're on Collins and you're looking up, you can build behind this Art Deco front high multi-story building, but you can't see the top of it from standing in the middle of the street or it doesn't pass. So the number of stories you can build is dictated by the sight line of a building built in the 1930s.
Yeah, and so this is an example where somebody is trying to create an aesthetic.
Yeah.
They're trying to create an experience on the street, a decor, and by so doing, they are limiting the ability of the marketplace to meet the demand for supply, and that restricted supply, the natural result, restricted supply in the face of demand, is going to be higher prices.
The French Quarter in New Orleans, same thing, right? And of course, there's the whole aesthetic that comes along with that, and it can drive value, and those retail tenants pay a lot and all of that. So proximity is one of the big drivers of value, and proximity is sometimes determined by these policies, zoning and otherwise. So this isn't to get you all confused or all infuriated. It's to say pay attention as you're investing out there into today's use and what might be coming down the road. Say I'm buying in a transitionary neighborhood. I need to know, okay, well, what's coming in? And gentrification can be a great way to ride up a wave, but at the same time, changes of use, as we've learned from the church example, aren't always beneficial to the current owner.
No, it's going to create problems and opportunities, and you need to be able to understand, from one person's perspective, it's a problem. From another person's perspective, it's an opportunity. And so you just have to recognize what the situation is and then decide whether you want to be on the problem side or the opportunity side. As for me, I'm going to go for the opportunity side.
Hey, big thanks to Randall O'Toole for sharing his thoughts with us today. His book is called American Nightmare, How the Government Undermines the Dream of Home Ownership, published by the Cato Institute. If you're interested in that, if you're interested in hanging out with the real estate guys, come on out to the New Orleans Investment Conference in beautiful New Orleans. Speaking of that town, we have a lot of fun. We meet a lot of cool people. My goodness, we have brought a lot of real estate guys, advocates, and friends this year. We're really excited. This is our 6th year in a row of attending. It's the oldest and longest running financial conference in America, the 43rd year, I believe. Joining the real estate guys this year, Robert Kiyosaki, Peter Schiff, and a whole bunch of other summit faculty will be coming. Plus, you'll meet Brian London, and it's a good time. You get all the details on our website at realestateguysradio.com under events. Until next week, go out and make some equity happen.
This episode of the Real Estate Guys Radio Show is brought to you by Paradigm Life. Powerful cash management strategies using life insurance. Learn more at beyourbank.com. Mid-South Home Buyers. Low-cost, turnkey cash flow properties in Memphis, Tennessee. Corporate Direct. Asset protection strategies for real estate investors from attorney and rich dad advisor Garrett Sutton. Find these and other great companies under the Resources tab at realestateguysradio.com. To learn how you can expose your product or service to the Real Estate Guys audience, call 888-489-7723 extension 4. That's 888-489-7723 extension 4. Or use the feedback page at realestateguysradio.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week right here on the Real Estate Guys Radio Show.